On November 8, 1960, the United States elected its 35th president in one of the closest elections in American history. The young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, narrowly defeated the incumbent Vice President Richard Nixon, securing 303 electoral votes to Nixon's 219. But what if Nixon had won the election instead? What if it was Nixon, not Kennedy, who took the oath of office on January 20th, 1961? That's the alternate history we'll be exploring in this video. In reality, the 1960 election came down to a few key states like Illinois and Texas that could have flipped to give Nixon the win. Perhaps some last-minute controversy impacted the results. Or maybe Nixon's performing better in the first televised presidential debates. Small shifts in events could have easily swung the election his way. Regardless of how it happened, let's imagine Richard Milhouse Nixon won that cliffhanger contest and became president. How might his administration have reshaped 1960s America and beyond? From domestic policy to foreign affairs, from the civil rights movement to the escalating Cold War tensions, so much could have unfolded differently under a President Nixon. If Richard Nixon had won the presidency in 1960, his first term likely would have looked quite different from the reformist new frontier ushered in by John F. Kennedy. On the home front, Nixon's conservative lean suggests he would not have made civil rights as high a priority as Kennedy did. The sweeping Civil Rights Act of 1964 may have faced even stronger opposition without JFK's advocacy. Progress on desegregation and voting rights could have been delayed. Nixon also had a more hardline anti-communist ideology, so he may have cracked down harder on protests and demonstrations compared to Kennedy. This could have further inflamed tensions with the civil rights movement. On economic policy, Nixon opposed New Deal programs and favored less government intervention. He may have pursued tax cuts and deregulation rather than increasing spending on social programs, as Kennedy aimed to do. Internationally, the hawkish Nixon took a much more aggressive stance toward the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. He likely would have continued or even escalated the arms race with more defense spending. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 may have played out quite differently under Nixon. His administration could have been quicker to pursue military action against the Soviets rather than the naval blockade that diffused the standoff. We've done a video on this channel looking at a scenario where JFK invaded Cuba during this period, but this outcome would have been more likely with Nixon in office. Nixon was also a firm anti-communist when it came to the Vietnam War. It's quite possible he would have deployed more troops and pursued a more aggressive intervention strategy instead of the gradual escalation we saw under Kennedy and Johnson. Overall, Nixon's first term may have set the country on a more conservative trajectory domestically. Internationally, though, Nixon might have escalated tensions with the Soviet Union more than when compared to the reformist progressive vision of JFK's new frontier. As Nixon's first term came to a close in 1964, he would likely have sought re-election to continue pursuing his conservative anti-communist agenda. But he would have, without being elected in 1960, John F. Kennedy may have fallen slightly out of the public eye and thus never been assassinated. This would give the charismatic incumbent the chance to be the Democratic nominee taking on Nixon in 1964. An election rematch between Nixon and Kennedy could have proven to be another very close and hard-fought contest. Kennedy may have tried to rally support by touting achievements he had worked towards since losing the 1960 election. He could have gathered support from the South by pointing out Nixon's lack of drive towards civil rights and the escalating tensions with the Soviets. Ultimately, the 1964 result may have come down to the nation's judgment on Nixon's handling of foreign policy issues like the Vietnam War. Had he begun deploying extensive ground troops as many expected he would, this could have become a major liability. But if he managed to keep involvement limited, he may have been able to run as a hardliner without appearing cavalier about soldiers' lives. On the other hand, if Kennedy's tragic assassination did still occur, the 1964 election would have looked very different. Lyndon B. Johnson likely would have been the Democratic nominee after having been JFK's running mate in 1960. He likely would have attacked Nixon in the same manner, but due to his lack of charisma, may not have been as strong of opposition as Kennedy. Either President Nixon going for re-election against JFK or LBJ, 1964 would have been an incredibly dramatic and convoluted election. Nixon's performance in his first term could have determined whether he earned a second term as voters, judged his policies at home and abroad. If Nixon had won a second term in 1964, the civil rights movement's major milestones and trajectory likely would have changed significantly. Without LBJ's prodding, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that prohibited discriminatory voting practices may have stalled or been weakened. Nixon's hardline stance against protesters could have brought harsher crackdowns on civil disobedience from groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. likely would have faced more opposition from the administration. On the other hand, Negro leaders may have been more motivated to organize against Nixon, galvanizing wider public support for the movement's goals. The struggle could have been even more protracted, but may have pressured future administrations to act more decisively. One area where Nixon may have doubled down was the space race against the Soviet Union. Beating the Soviets to the moon very likely would have been an even higher priority as a matter of national prestige and technological superiority during the Cold War. NASA could have received even more funding and resources to accelerate the Apollo program timeline. There's a good chance American astronauts could have landed on the lunar surface ahead of the actual 1969 date in our history. Of course, no issue would have loomed larger than Nixon's approach to Vietnam. His fear of appearing weak against communism could have led to a significantly expanded ground operation compared to our timeline's gradual escalation. Instead of beginning troop withdrawals by 1969, Nixon may have ordered a further deployment of hundreds of thousands of ground forces to pursue complete military victory. This could have dramatically escalated bombing campaigns and US casualties before any negotiated settlement. A re-elected Nixon may have taken an even more aggressive posture against the Soviet Union across the latter half of the 1960s as well. We could have seen greater US involvement in global anti-communist efforts from Asia to Latin America. Increased defense spending and the bitter space race could have brought the Cold War's tensions to a boiling point. Hopefully, Nixon's experienced crisis management could have prevented any direct military confrontation with Russia from occurring. Overall, the late 1960s may have seen an America even more embroiled in the Vietnam conflict, while taking a harder line domestically and internationally in the Cold War struggle against communism. Having Richard Nixon instead of John F. Kennedy take the oath of office in January 1961 could have dramatically reshaped the course of the 1960s in America and around the world. From domestic policies like civil rights to foreign entanglements like the Vietnam War, almost every aspect of that turbulent decade might have played out starkly different under a President Nixon. Whether such an alternate path could have avoided the turmoil of the late 1960s or only compounded it remains up for debate. But there's no doubt that simple shift at the ballot box in 1960 could have profoundly altered the course of history.